Good morning. Today is September 6th, 2024. My name is Ateem Aneda George. I'm a Green Fellow with the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Ambassador Aurelia Erskine Brazeal. Good morning, Madam Ambassador.
Good morning, Ateem. It's good to see you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by asking you to tell us your origin story.
Sure, I'll be happy to start at the beginning. I was born in 1943 in Chicago, Illinois, at St. Luke's Hospital. My mother and father had planned to have both of their children. I have an older sister. To have both of their children in Chicago for two reasons. One, to make sure that we had birth certificates, since Black children born in the South were not always issued birth certificates at that time. And secondly, because my mother's mother lived in Chicago, so they had a place to stay and get to the hospital from there. So for those reasons, I was born in Chicago. I was there for all of 2 weeks and then returned to Atlanta, Georgia, where my parents lived. My father was the dean of Morehouse College when there was only one dean in existence. He worked with President Benjamin Mays. And my mother was the alumni secretary at Spelman College, the college for Black women. Morehouse is the college for Black men. I grew up in that college atmosphere. And as again planning, my parents sent us to Spelman Nursery School. Spelman had a nursery school at that time, which was practice for Spelman students who were going to go into education of children. And so we went to Spelman Nursery School. We went to Oglethorpe Elementary School, which was a laboratory school for Atlanta University. So again, it was a place of high standards and avoided the soft bigotry of low expectations. Of course, this was all under segregation, so there was no opportunity to go to integrated schools. There were two high schools for Blacks in Atlanta at that time, one down the street from our house, George Washington High School. My parents had planned and saved, in retrospect, saved money to send my sister and myself away to high school. My sister went to Northfield School for Girls in Northfield, Massachusetts. I followed her 2 or 3 years later, also at Northfield School for Girls in Northfield, Massachusetts. That was one of the few boarding schools that accepted Black students in the United States. There were a few others whose names I can't remember, but we both found ourselves at Northfield. I graduated from Northfield School for Girls and then returned to Spelman College for college. Two reasons. One sort of probably not so serious a reason, although to me at the time it seemed serious. I had been accepted to Colby College in Maine and was considering going to Colby when it snowed on the 3rd of May, my graduation year from Northfield. And I decided I did not want to go any further north than where I was at that time. That was the sort of facetious reason. The second reason was I felt that you make your friends for life in college. And the United States at that time, under segregation, I felt my friends would be Black, and I wanted to go to an HBCU. And of course, since I grew up around Spelman and Morehouse, Spelman seemed logical to me to attend. And indeed, that's how it turned out. at least in my life. I have friends for life from Spelman, and I'm not in touch with anybody from my high school and Northfield School for Girls on an ongoing basis. So that's how I found myself at Spelman College.
May I ask you this? When
Mhm.
did you get the first inkling that you might be interested in international affairs?
Sure. I had attended a camp, summer camp called Encampment for Citizenship, and it's a program that existed. Um, Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a friend of the organization and other people, but in the minds of some people, it was considered a radical, far left, communistic kind of camp because it brought people together from all races and for the summer. And the idea of the camp was to devise your own system of government, so that the camp I attended was in Puerto Rico. And there were students from Latin American countries at the camp, along with Americans, and we were of all races and countries. And the Latin American students would stand up in front of the group and say, as a future leader of my country, I'm here to tell you, X, Y, and Z. And I was sitting there thinking, well, what culture made these people think that at their age they would be a future leader of their country when I could not even envisage being a future leader of my country, given the system that we had of apartheid. So I became fascinated with the Latin American countries, and that sort of led me to pursue Latin American studies in graduate school after finishing Spelman. The opportunity I also had to go on Experiment in International Living, a program that sent American students overseas to live with foreign families in various countries and then have group experiences. I went to Sweden and lived with a Swedish family, and then we had sort of the group would come together, and we had group experiences also in France and Belgium. So I think those two experiences helped, but I want to back up a bit to 1955, when my father received what was then called a Merrill Fellowship from Morehouse College to send faculty overseas and to broaden the experience of faculty. The Merrill Fellowships and Scholarships for students, fellowships for faculty, was started by a guy named Charles Merrill, who was in the Korean War and found himself in a foxhole with a graduate of Morehouse College. So he heard all about Morehouse at that time in the foxhole. And when he came back to the States, he either is a member of a wealthy family or became wealthy himself. I don't know. I've never particularly looked up his background, but in any case, he started giving money to Spelman and to Morehouse for fellowships. So my father had a fellowship in 1955 to go to Europe, and took my mother and my sister and myself with him. So at the age of around 11, I found myself in Europe. And it was interesting because as a Black family, we were an unusual sight because that wasn't that far after World War II. And we would go out and stop at a fruit stand on the street just to look at the fruit. And we turn around and there would be about 100 people standing around looking at us, just looking. They weren't, you did not get the feeling that they were threatening, They were simply curious. And so I remember that from that trip, and sort of what we did. We went to Italy and Switzerland, Belgium, France, UK, Ireland, and Scotland. My father was off doing whatever he was doing. And then we were, as a family, would sightsee. So that was, in a sense, my first exposure to overseas and to foreigners, which was a foundation for my experience then in Puerto Rico with the Latin American students, and then with the experiment in international living. So at Spelman, I applied for a program designed to get minorities into the Foreign Service, at that time called Foreign Affairs Scholars, funded by the Ford Foundation. And if you were accepted, it paid for 2 years of graduate school to get a master's. And then you came into the Foreign Service with an obligation to serve at least for 5 years. I was accepted, excuse me. I went to Columbia University in New York for my master's, and then came into the Foreign Service. So that's how I came into the Foreign Service. I support affirmative action because people who come through programs, affirmative action programs, likely may not have even considered careers in the area that they've been accepted in. Number one. Number two, it's gave advantages to me because this is still under segregation, and the state of Georgia would not allow Black students to enter the universities in Georgia. And so, in my view, stupidly, the state of Georgia would use its taxpayer money to give money to Black students who were accepted in grad schools outside the state of Georgia. And so the state of Georgia also helped pay for my graduate degree, for which I'm somewhat thankful, given the fact that it was to keep me out of any university in Georgia. So that sort of, I hope, answers your question of how I got interested in foreign affairs, having been exposed early and then followed up with other programs. And then, of course, coming into the Foreign Service. My first assignment was Argentina. And so I learned Spanish and I went to Argentina, which fit my interest in Latin American countries. I had been coming in at that time. I was in the State Department, and before I entered the Foreign Service formally, I had been brought into the State Department under what category, I don't know. But I was brought in and was working in the Latin American Bureau, in an office that handled the Alliance for Progress, which was a program that the US had with Latin American countries, called Alianza para el Progreso. And I guess in a sense, I was a little bit ambivalent about coming into the Foreign Service. So I was content to keep working in this, whatever category I was in, and in the job I was in. But there was going to be a freeze on bringing people into the Foreign Service. So I was told either I needed to come in right away, or they didn't know how long the freeze would last, and what that would do to my circumstances. So I came into the Foreign Service in 1968. Formally came into the Foreign Service in 1968, which, as you know from history, was a momentous year in this country. Medgar Evers had been assassinated in Mississippi the year before, in 1967, in the fall. And then you had, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King assassinated. You had Bobby Kennedy assassinated. You had the Tet Offensive in terms of Vietnam. You had demonstrations all over the country um, with the more right-wing white supremacists in our country slotting in the people who protested into the excessively left-wing, communistic, socialist kind of categories that you hear about today in 2024 also. So that I guess in Argentina, I kept looking north to my country, thinking that we looked like we were about to explode. And again, the question is, why was I in the Foreign Service? It kept coming up in my mind. I was not exactly sure. I had a 2-year assignment. The first year was in the counselor section, and I happily had a boss named Luis Villalobos, who was very mentoring, but I did not like counselor work because I thought the US law that I had to apply was racist. And so I didn't particularly want to continue doing counselor work. The embassy had one other junior officer, we would call junior officers at the time, one other junior officer in the embassy in the economic section. So I got together with him and I asked him, I said, well, look, would you be interested in switching places? I could take your place in the econ section, you could take my place in counselor section. And if you are, then we'll go to the embassy management and ask if we could set up that program. The embassy did not have a formal rotational program for junior officers at that time. He said yes. So that's what happened. I went to the economic section in my second year, and he went to the counselor section in his second year at Post. I had been asked when I arrived in Argentina, I don't know, 2 or 3 months after arriving, to give a speech to the embassy Americans about the Black movements for civil rights in the US. And I said, sure, I'll be happy to do that. And so I gave a speech. I talked about Dr. King's movement, SCLC. I talked about SNCC. I talked about the Black Panthers. I talked about Malcolm X. I talked about all of the sort of thought patterns that existed in the civil rights movement. I thought, at least, I had done a good job, but I had people come up afterwards. These are all embassy family members and officers patting me on the shoulder, sort of saying, oh, you shouldn't think like that. And I'm going, well, what is wrong with these people? And it turned out a couple of things I thought were wrong. One, they had perhaps been out of their own country for much of the 60s. And so they were out of date and had very dated views of Black people and what we were allowed to do. And two, I internalized a way of thinking that I then had to undo as much as I could undo it later in life when I came to a leadership position in the Foreign Service. And that way of thinking was simply to not talk about my own personal views on issues, particularly politics, race, and race issues in my own country. I simply didn't discuss them with my fellow Americans. That was what I took, because I became the resident radical in the embassy because of that speech I gave. And indeed, it proved true, because when I moved to the economic section, my boss was a guy named Ed Williams, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Southerner from North Carolina, white man. And he indeed expected me, when I arrived, to be the resident radical. That was what he had heard through the embassy grapevine. And we became good friends, and stayed friends until he passed. But it just, that sort of reinforced that view that I should not talk about my own views. I could talk about policy, I could talk about lots of other things, but not my own deeply held personal views, because I did not want to be pigeonholed, because then you're only allowed to know what that particular pigeonhole is supposed to know. And that is not what I wanted. I wanted to know about the range of issues and not be kept in the dark.
Yeah, you answered my question. I was going to ask, did you find, looking back, that that was a wise approach? And I think you've already answered that.
I think it was a wise approach. But it also, as I said, this was, by now I arrived in Argentina in 68, 70, 71. I was leaving, and my next assignment was supposed to be Trinidad. And I communicated with people how I can't even remember, maybe through the executive office of the embassy or somehow. Anyway, I did not want to go overseas. I wanted an assignment back in Washington. Because, as I said, I looked at my country, it looked like we were going up in smoke. So I broke somehow that assignment to Trinidad, and was assigned to an office in Washington. I was happy to be back in the US, away from fellow diplomats who had not been in the States for so long that they had their own pigeonholes for what Blacks were allowed to do. I was in an office in the Economic Bureau, but I hated the job, actually. It was an office that was supposed to review required annual reports from embassies around the world on various economic issues. You would review the reports and then send back comments on how to improve them or make them better, or whether they were adequate or fine. Boring, I thought. Not a lot of, not busy. And also my bosses didn't want to say anything negative about any of their reports. So I didn't find it very challenging either in terms of what you could say. Happily, up the corridor from me was Richard Fox, Dick Fox, who was in the Foreign Service, a Black man, and a mentor from my point of view, because he allowed me to come to his office every now and then to vent. And then he gave me some very good advice, which was to stay at least a year to show that I could do the job, and then go ahead and try to break the assignment, because that would be, people who broke assignments were not looked upon favorably in general in the Foreign Service, because you could be considered a troublemaker. So I took his advice. I did the job for a year. I enlisted the support of, I think her name was Frances Wilson. She was the only woman, white woman, executive director of a bureau. She ran the administrative part of the Economic Bureau. Without her support, you weren't going to get anywhere. So I enlisted her support, had her support, broke the assignment, and was assigned to the Operations Center, which is considered a very good assignment in the Foreign Service. for people. So I was in the operations center, which is an office that receives messages from overseas, disseminates them to the senior officials in the department, and then sends back or can send out messages from that from those officials with bureau input, geographic bureau input. You also did a summary of cable reporting from around the world for the Secretary of State. So it's a three-person office, an editor who was April Glaspie, a woman who reached ambassadorial level in the department. Sam Fry, who was the senior watch officer, and then I was the junior watch officer. And you worked shifts. So you might work during the day, and then you were off a couple of days, and then you'd come back and work in the evenings, and then you were off, and then you'd come back and work overnight. So it was a 24-hour operation designed to look at the flow of information coming from around the world from our embassies and consulates. A great position. I learned a lot. I felt that it was you could see a worldwide view of what issues were important, and you could see the flow of information out from the building going out and all the information coming back in. So it gave you a very good perch, I thought, to understand how the ebb and flow of events around the world affected the United States. At the same time, remembering I had these sort of thoughts in the back of my mind, was the Foreign Service still a place where I wanted to be, given all of the things that were happening domestically in the US. So I had applied to the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard, thinking that I needed to add to my skills and toolkit, as they called it back at the time in the day. If I was going to leave the department, then I needed to do that. But I had applied on my own, thinking actually that I wouldn't get into Harvard, and I was accepted. And so I went to the Operations Center senior people and explained the situation and said I'd like to go. And they said they thought it was a good idea. They supported me. I did not go under any department auspices. I funded it on my own and went on my own. But I had, could you hold a minute? I need to get a phone.
Yes.
Okay. I had learned enough by the time I had broken my assignment in the Economic Bureau, went to the Operations Center, to know that I really needed to work out a job for me to come back to in the Foreign Service before I went to Harvard. So I, again, having done a good job in the Operations Center from their point of view, I worked out with them that I would be at Harvard for the academic year and then come back and go to the other side of the operation, executive secretariat, to be in what they call the line. And the line were officers who were responsible for specific bureaus in the Department of State in terms of receiving all of the memos and written material that came up from within the Department of State that were supposed to go to any of the principals, the Secretary of State, Deputy Secretary, Economic, the Undersecretaries for Political or Economic, or any of the senior members of the Foreign Service operation on the top floor, which was the 7th floor. So when I went to Harvard, I came back, and then I started working in the Secretariat. And that I'm explaining what they did because it was the opposite of what happened in the Operations Center. The Operations Center receives all of the information coming from overseas as it flows into the department, and then it sees all the information going back out to all of our posts around the world. The Secretariat line received all of the paper moving within the department, going up to the principals for decision, and saw all of the paper flowing back down to the different bureaus and offices in the department for action. So I could see I had the advantage of seeing both sides of that operation, the paper coming from overseas and the paper coming up. And that gives you a great view, I found, again, of what's important and how decisions are made in the department. And you also, people in the Secretariat operation also traveled with the Secretary of State and other principals, if necessary, on foreign trips to sort of be the organizational center for the trip in terms of receiving information and making sure it got to the right people in the delegation, particularly the Secretary of State. So I was able to travel as well as see how the information flowed up and flowed down from the 7th floor in terms of decisions made by the secretary or the deputy secretary or undersecretaries. That, I think, later in my career helped me understand how to write and get attention given to issues I thought important from an overseas post. It's how you insert it into the department's mechanisms for moving paper, if I'm making myself clear. I worked with Tom Pickering, who is a well-known senior official in the department. I worked with, I guess, in my 40-year career, I worked for 13 secretaries of state under eight presidents. And they were Republican or Democrat. It didn't matter. We were apolitical, as we should be. So I got a good view early on in my career of how to influence a bureaucracy. After I finished my assignment on what was called the line in the Secretariat, I became the desk officer responsible for Paraguay and Uruguay, 2 countries, again, in the Southern Cone, which meshed with my assignment in Argentina. And so I was happy to become a desk officer. Again, I think from that spot, you learn how to influence the bureaucracy, not only in the State Department, but in other agencies, because as desk officer, you would have to talk to the Defense Department or the Treasury Department or Commerce or any of the other components of the US government that might be working or have an interest in that particular country. 2 things I was somewhat proud of, well, the policy issues, of course, but 2 other things. The Paraguayan ambassador to the United States was dying of cancer, and I wanted to get him back home in a way that reflected well on the US government. He had been here a long time. So I was working with the Defense Department to see if we could get a plane to fly him back to Paraguay. And was basically hearing no, we can't do that, blah, blah. So finally I sort of said, I had to sit and think, how do you influence that level of the DOD? And I said, well, how many times will you have a chance to fly down the spine of Latin America all the way to Paraguay? Perhaps we could call it a training mission, and and get the job done, which we were able to do. So I was very happy about that, because this ambassador, one, arrived before he had passed away, but two, the president of the country, the entire cabinet of the country was there when this plane came with the United States of America on the side, to welcome this ambassador back to his own country. And I think it did the U.S. It gave us a lot of soft power influence from then on because of that. The second item I was proud of for Uruguay was burst a bubble. I just now forgot the name of. There were all these porpoises that used to do tricks at different aquariums. I can't remember the name of the porpoise. But in any case, I found out that there were several of them. I thought it was only one, and that this one porpoise was carried around to different water parks in the United States. But that's not true. There were several of them, and that sort of burst my bubble, thinking there had been only one. In any case, we transported a porpoise to Uruguay for a show, and I had to learn all sorts of things about how you have to have them in the plane, keep them wet, and food, and all kinds of things. But we were able to do that too. So those two things, in addition to supporting the embassies in Paraguay and Uruguay in terms of substance, was fun. I went to Paraguay. The ambassador, George Landau at the time, had a lunch for me. I went to lunch, lovely lunch, Paraguayan officials. And afterwards, the ladies, the wives at the lunch, went into the living room with Mrs. Landau, and the men went into the study to have cognac and whatever with the ambassador. And of course, I went into the study because I'm not a woman per se. I'm the desk officer for Paraguay, a foreign service officer. And I remember Mrs. Landau came through at one point, and she said, she stopped, she looked startled. She said, "Oh, here you are. I thought you had left." She said, "The women are in the living room having tea and coffee." And I said, "Oh, how nice." And I just stayed put where I was with the men, because we were talking policy. And that's, I remember that. Again, the gender sort of issues cropping up. From Paraguay and Uruguay desk officer, I went over to the Department of Treasury here in Washington on detail. They wanted to start a similar operation as the Operations Center and the Secretariat line operation at the Treasury Department under Secretary Blumenthal. And State asked me if I would be interested in going. And I said yes, because that would, again, by then I was interested in becoming an economic officer, and this would give me a good view of economic issues at Treasury and get to know people at Treasury. So I was at Treasury for a couple of years, working with them to set up That was a whole different culture to learn and to operate in, and also to um, sort of inculcate the acceptance in the Treasury Department people of having someone tell them, no, this paper is not acceptable. You have to go back and redo this section or clear it with this other organization within the Treasury or something like that to coordinate. And also to go on trips with Secretary Blumenthal around the world. So I did that. It sounds like a large swath of time to be in Washington from coming out of Argentina and then all of these assignments. And it's true because the regulations at State Department at that point allowed you to return from overseas and to be back in Washington for 8 years. So I was back here for 8 years before I had to go overseas because the regulations required that I go overseas. At that point, I received an assignment to Japan, to Tokyo, as in a new position as an economic officer. And so I went to Japan for 3 years doing economic work. I enjoyed the assignment very much. I would say for people thinking about coming to the Foreign Service or younger officers already in the Foreign Service, I wanted to just explain, this was a new position I had. It did not have a job description. And when I got to Japan, I had a boss who sort of said, well, he didn't tell me anything about what to do or what issues I should follow or anything. And you have a choice at that point. You can either start complaining that no one will tell you what to do and there isn't a job description and it's, sort of a negative kind of situation for you, or you can see it as an opportunity. And I saw it as a lovely opportunity. So I went around and talked to all of my colleagues in the economic section, and I explained that I wasn't trying to steal any issues from them, but I wanted to ask them what issues they thought should be covered that they didn't have time to cover because they'd been there longer than I had, certainly, and had a perspective. And so from those conversations, I cobbled together my job description in terms of covering issues that they had thought should be covered, but none of them had time to do that. And I wrote my own job description, discussed it with my boss, and that became the job description. No one was irritated. I wasn't going to sit around and just wait for someone to come and tell me what to do. That seemed counterproductive, particularly from a woman and a Black African American point of view. That just wasn't going to happen. The section was sort of operated by the commercial side of the operation, and there was a commercial counselor, and then an economic counselor, and then a minister counselor for economic and commercial. The commercial counselor I didn't like, in part because I didn't like the way he treated his wife in public. Didn't sit well with me. He was a male chauvinist. He was in charge of who received newspaper subscriptions, so that each morning you would get your own English language newspaper. So I went to him and I asked him, said I'd like to get a newspaper. And he said, you'll get exactly what your predecessor got. And since I had no predecessor, that basically meant I would get nothing. So I sat in my office and thought a minute and said, well, how can I deal with this? And so the newspapers were put in slots against people's names in a sort of a mail slot kind of approach. And so I just always got to the embassy before he did, and I took his newspaper for the next 2 years or so. I had my newspaper. I don't know if he ever thought something happened to his, but I had a newspaper. I was happy. That's how I dealt with that. Um, what are some other things that might have happened in terms of gender? I covered East-West trade at the time. That was what we called Japan's trade with Russia, Japan's trade with China. It was the name for East-West trade. So I covered those issues in my portfolio, and I was called by the military attaché's office, the representative of the Defense Department who worked in the embassy under the authority of the ambassador. And they called me up to ask me for names of some of my Japanese contacts to invite to a dinner. And then they said, well, we can't invite you because the dinner is stag. And at that time, there were no cell phones. This is before cell phones. So I had a old-fashioned phone, and I said, well, stag doesn't mean without women. Stag means without spouse. And so if you think you're going to get any more names of contacts from me, you can forget about it. And I slammed down the phone and sort of sat there. And about 10 minutes later, they called back and they said, oh, you're invited to this dinner. And I said, oh, how kind of you. I'd be delighted to come. One, I educated them on what stag meant, which was without spouse, had nothing to do with gender. And secondly, the reason I wanted to be at the dinner is that these were my contacts. And if I'm not there and visible as a player, so to speak, in the embassy context, including with the defense people, then would I be worthwhile keeping as an embassy contact? So I considered it important for me to be there. And I was the only woman, and that's just the way that goes. But you have to take these moments to educate people along the way, because it just was not even in their thought process that stag meant women could come. And I had a husband, so he was not there because it was stag. So, in any case, I enjoyed Japan tremendously. The culture, the the approach to life, that things are not perfect, and therefore the appreciation of imperfect art or an imperfect ceremony. The only thing I didn't particularly like was that everything was planned out, including fun. So I went with Japanese friends to see some temples, and they did. If I got tired and said, "Oh well, let's stop," "Oh no, we have 3 more temples to go to." So it was almost like you had to fulfill this plan that had been set up. You couldn't deviate, and that was an insight into the culture. I also met some Americans who did not adjust to Japan. At one party, this American said, "I'm going to have to leave because no one here looks like me. I walk on the streets. There's no one looks like me. People just they have different behaviors and I said, funny you should mention that, because that's sort of how I feel back in my own country, when people expect Black people to to be a certain way, you know. So maybe you should think about leaving or staying, but with a different perspective. Anyway, you could get into some conversations. I guess I'm talking too much. I left Japan and came back to the Economic Bureau in an office called Development Finance, where you worked with the Treasury Department to come up with how the US would vote within the World Bank or the IMF, International Monetary Fund, about loans and grants to various countries. So it was a way to coordinate those issues within the Economic Bureau. I accepted the job. By then, my objective in the Foreign Service personnel-wise was to make sure the personnel system never got their hands on me. And so the way to do that was simply to try to do as good a job as I could, so that people asked for me to come work for them. And so Adrian Basora, who is the director of that office, asked me to come work for him. I had three criteria for accepting jobs. One, I wanted to work for someone who could teach me something. I wanted to work for someone who was not a bigot. And you could find out through the informal gossip network if they were bigots or not. And then three, to have fun. But you notice that from Japan, I came back to the United States. So I would say that the main thing that kept me in the Foreign Service was the flexibility of the personnel system to allow you to come back to Washington for assignments and then to go overseas. And so that allowed me to pursue my own personal interests after work, but still be in the Foreign Service and do what I thought was important work. And that flexibility is something that young officers or people aspiring to come in the Foreign Service can think about, because that flexibility is still there, I think, sufficiently that you can craft your own approach. So 40 years in the Foreign Service, roughly 20 in Washington, 20 overseas is how it worked out. But I was happy to come back to the States from my assignment in Japan because of my own domestic interest in civil rights and doing things after hours. I was back here in the Economic Bureau. I already mentioned my attraction to new positions, because the first time I went to Japan, it was a new position. And I was contacted by the Japan desk office here in the State Department to become their first deputy director for economics, a new position in the Japan office. So I went to EB and talked about all of that. And they let me go and become the first. So I became the first deputy director for economics in the Japan office. And that, again, brought me back to Japan issues, but also the challenge and the enjoyment I find from new positions that you can create, and your own job description, and be flexible about what you put in it. And from there, I went to the senior seminar, which is which was the most senior educational program, training program in the US government, run by the State Department for officers who were considered going to proceed to leadership positions in the department. I was chosen, I was still in 01, I had not been promoted yet into the senior Foreign Service. So I went to the senior seminar for a year, and academic year, And from there, I was contacted by Ambassador Mike Mansfield, who was our U.S. ambassador to Japan, to return to the embassy as the minister counselor for economic affairs, the number 3 position in the embassy. I respected Ambassador Mike Mansfield so much I would have gone anywhere he asked for. So I found myself returning to Japan. It had not necessarily been on my list, but as I said, I would have gone anywhere he asked. He was a national treasure of this country, and people should read what he did in the Senate. He was a member of all of the military service. He served in the military services that existed when he was a young man. I think the Air Force is the only one he didn't serve in because it did not exist when he was in the military. He served in the Senate. He was crucial to many votes on civil rights, as well as Fulbright scholars and other programs that people may have heard of. And then he was our ambassador in Japan for quite a while. Wonderful person. After Japan, I was asked by a mentor if I would be interested in becoming ambassador to the Federated States of Micronesia, which is also in the East Asia Bureau of the State Department. And I said yes, although I was receiving advice from different friends and acquaintances in the Foreign Service. Don't take the position, it's too small, it's an insult, wait for something better, others take it, and whatever. The reason there was this sort of toing and froing was the fact that once you became an ambassador, and once you become an ambassador, you have to get ambassador level assignments after that, or you're out of the Foreign Service. So I could have considered the fact that I would have had to leave the Foreign Service after my service in Micronesia if I did not get the equivalent of ambassador level assignments. So people were giving me different advice, but I went back to my parents' advice to me, which was when opportunity knocks, you step through that door. So I accepted that position and became, again, my attraction, I became the first US ambassador to the Federated States of Micronesia. Again, having that flexibility to be creative in what we looked at. It was a very small embassy. There was just one other American officer, and then we had 5 locally hired people who worked in the embassy. But it was an extremely busy and educational post for me. One, because it was so small, it forced me to learn all of the administrative rules and regulations in the Department of State that apply to embassies, which gave a good foundation for me when I went on to other embassies, because I could know some of the rules and regulations that people were telling me had to be followed. And number 2, being the first ambassador, we were switching from, we had helped Micronesia become an independent country, a member of the United Nations, and but we had a lot of different parts of the US government operating in Micronesia because we had been the trustee of Micronesia after World War II under UN auspices. And so we basically were out there, everyone from the US Postal Service to the US Weather Service to the State Department were operating in Micronesia. And the domestic US government agencies operating there basically treated within their own culture and bureaucracy, treated Micronesia as if it were a state of the United States, basically, which meant they did not apply foreign policy thinking to what they were doing. So I like to say I unearthed 44 different parts of the US government that were operating in Micronesia that the State Department did not necessarily think about or know about, and nor did those agencies really recognize the fact that now Micronesia was an independent country and they needed to work through the State Department because they weren't accustomed to doing that. And unearthing those 44 different parts of the US government allowed us to look at operations and try to coordinate better within the US government, but also deal with the awkwardness of the State Department being responsible for policy, but the Interior Department of the United States government being responsible for funneling the money Congress approved for Micronesia through the Interior Department. So it was an interesting, helpful, awkward kind of post. I enjoyed it tremendously. The Micronesians are people living on a small island nation are different in terms of their approach. I would say their sense of humor, I would ask, okay, your sense of humor seems to be picking the one thing about a person that they hate and then just teasing them about it. And they say, yes, that's exactly what we do. So it's different approaches. Seeing a 3-year-old kid with a machete was a bit disconcerting, but kids are accustomed to seeing machetes, so they just carry them around. In any case, there were lots of practices and ways of thinking that I learned and enjoyed that assignment very much. I was there for 3 years. After that, I was asked to serve as ambassador to Kenya. So I went from 2 American posts, small first post in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, to one of the largest embassies that we had in Africa. And was in Kenya for 3 years. I'll go back, but from there I went from Kenya. I was brought back to Washington again as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific in that bureau. From there, I went to the Foreign Service Institute to be Dean of the Senior Seminar and to create the Leadership and Management School that Secretary Powell wanted to create. And then from there, I was asked to be ambassador to Ethiopia. I went to Ethiopia and then came back, and I was a diplomat in residence at Howard University, in part because I wanted to get to know the younger generations, because to lead them, you had to begin to think differently and about leadership, because you had Gen X and Gen Z sort of coming into play. And then from there, I retired formally after 40 years. So that was my career. I can go back and give examples of this, that, and the other thing, but I would say that as to Black women, to women, to Black women, to young people thinking about the Foreign Service, given my doubts early on in my career about whether the Foreign Service was right for me, I had to sit myself down and think, what is it that I enjoyed about the career and could see myself staying? And I thought there's several things. One, there's an emphasis on continuing education. And I found that I liked that, and I found it stimulating. Two, that you had the flexibility, as I mentioned, within the system to craft your own career as you saw fit to meet your interest. In other words, serving long times in Washington or serving overseas. So there was that flexibility and choice. I like that. I'm a person who likes change, and the Foreign Service brings change all the time. Either you're changing a post, or you're changing your portfolio, or the colleagues around you are leaving and therefore changing, or you're leaving and changing, or changing geographic bureau. So change is built into the system, and I enjoy change. Finally, you're working with people who are intellectually stimulating, interesting, delightful people. And I don't mean just the Americans, but also the local people, locally hired people, and people in the country as you meet them. So that that was an aspect of a career that I liked, comparing it to other careers that people had. So I wound up, after thinking all of that through and learning those things about myself, I could see staying in the Foreign Service, which I did for 40 years. Secondly, I also, as an economic officer, highly recommend economic work to everybody, maybe even sticking to it as a career path, but certainly having exposure to the economic jobs as you move through your career, because economics is fundamental to how a country organizes itself. And there are no issues that don't have an economic base. And so you're free then to roam from the textile industry or frozen bull semen exports from the US, as I had to follow when I was in Japan, to banking, to energy, to outer space, even to any issue that's going to be relevant in the 21st century has an economic base. So I enjoyed that aspect as well, because you're working on issues that are important. And I did go back to Japan twice and work on Japan in between those two assignments, because Tokyo is one of the few embassies around the world that where economic issues can impact US domestic economic decisions, because of the power of Japan economically at the time I was there. And so that attracted me back to Tokyo for assignments because of the importance of economic issues. I think the Foreign Service has adjusted itself in terms of having tandem couples, or having or being aware of the needs of spouses who are not in the Foreign Service in terms of jobs. Everything has to be negotiated with the host country in terms of whether their spouses, our spouses, can work there. Depends on whether their spouses can work here. So it's a matter of negotiation. I also think in the Foreign Service that as I said at one point, optimism is the currency of diplomacy. You have to be an optimist or be optimistic. And I believe that, because you tend not to then fall into what I see as a trap of thinking about either or. And I think you can see in the United States in this political year that we're in 2024, you see the either or thinking. It's either this or that. Diplomats tend to think of and and/also, because you're looking for a win-win approach when you're negotiating with another country. And that reinforces that tendency to be optimistic or to find ways to where issues work out for both all sides included in an approach. And I think that's an important way to think, because when it's either or, you're only thinking about two possibilities. When you're thinking about and also, it opens up a window of possibilities and combinations. And that's what you want in diplomacy. So if you want to broaden your thinking, if you want to have fun, and you want, the secret weapon also for people coming in the Foreign Service who are minorities, or so-called minorities, Black, African Americans, Asian Americans, any hyphenated American. To me, the secret power is you know how W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about being a dual personality. You know how to be, you have the skills to be a minority, but you also have the skills and the thinking to be an American. And that is powerful when you combine all of those together. You're not thrown off your stride because you don't know how to be a minority. And you know how Americans can be. So you have that insight that also doesn't throw you off. And that's our secret power moving forward. So come on in, whatever you are, including white Americans, because white is a color. So come on in and learn. I hope you do. It's the best career ever, and we need the talent. As I said, I learned early in my career not to talk about my personal thoughts about issues, and it worked. When I became a leader, though, when I moved up into the senior Foreign Service and had staff that I supervised and a country team comprised of all agencies at an embassy under the authority of the ambassador, I realized that I had to unlearn keeping my thoughts to myself, because I had to share my thinking with my team in terms of policies, approach to a country, or why I sort of interpreted what was going on a certain way. So I had to unlearn keeping my thoughts to myself as a leader, because you had to persuade a team of people to support your particular direction that you wanted to go in a country, or either back in Washington or in an embassy, and that was a difficult for me. I'm not sure I ever succeeded totally in fully explaining to people what I was thinking, because of that early experience in my career back in Argentina and my first assignment. So I think there's a balance that an individual will have to conclude on their own, where they come out in terms of sharing their thinking versus keeping their thoughts to themselves. But as a leader, you're going to have to share your thinking so that you can have followers who support the direction that you want to go in.
Ambassador Brazeal, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your lived experience. This was a very rich treatment of the topic. Thank you.
Thank you.